Hi there, my name's Victoria Charid and I'm the founder of Muma Nurture. So people often ask about me and what my story is, and today I'm going to share that or some of it with you. I have pre-prepared what I'm going to say, so I will be reading from it. I apologise if that looks a bit odd, but parts of my story can be upsetting for me, and I've never actually um, been able to get the whole way through without getting upset or sidetracked. And generally in life, I would take the approach of making things as easy for ourselves as possible. So, being that I lead by example, that is what I'm going to do. So, I am 44 years old and 39 weeks pregnant. This is actually my second pregnancy in 2 years, and something I just couldn't have comprehended 7 years ago when I first started Muma Nurture. At that point in time, I was still married to my ex-husband, and after a more than 5 year struggle with infertility, had accepted the reality that we would never have children together, that he would never understand how I felt about having children, or indeed not having them, and probably our marriage wasn't going to survive long term. However, what I did have is a wealth of understanding, personal and professional, about infertility and baby loss that I felt maybe I could do something with. When I first started trying for a baby, I was naive enough to believe it would be as simple as stopping contraception and waiting to see what happened. Do you know what happened? Nothing. Months and years of nothing that nobody had ever prepared me for. I always thought the job was stopping yourself getting pregnant, and once you wanted to, it was the easiest thing in the world. It wasn't. I tried all sorts, the sensible, the crazy, nothing worked. That always felt like it was my fault, and it must be something that I was doing wrong. I think even the medical investigations put the assumption on the female and add the guilt or blame or whatever we're calling it. That was maybe especially true in my case, as my ex-husband had children. But I've also supported hundreds of women now through their infertility journey, and many times when there is a reason and it's male factor, that hasn't been discovered until years down the track, because equal investigation of both parties just doesn't always happen from the beginning. I saw so many therapists offering different treatments and promising to get me pregnant. Nothing did, and I was just left feeling like more of a failure. Along the way, I did various therapy courses and extra learning around infertility to try and increase my knowledge and really my chances. I was also becoming a more and more experienced counsellor. I'd worked mainly with grief since the beginning and had become the baby bereavement specialist at the agency I worked for. And alongside that, I'd been teaching counselling for a couple of years. I began to see infertility as compound grief, a loss experienced each month, which adds to the month before and the months before that, which may not be of a tangible person, but was of your hopes, dreams, and plans, while your life could effectively be in limbo for endless amounts of time and you waited for the potentially impossible to happen. What if it never did? When I knew we weren't going to have children, I knew I needed to grieve. But I also understood the difficulties in doing that when I wasn't sure it was the end. I wasn't sure I could accept I would never be a mum. And others around me couldn't really see that I'd lost anything. I felt alone, misunderstood, and totally abnormal. I knew I wasn't really, that others must also feel like me. For a short time, I'd been part of a fertility support group where I clearly didn't belong, and I was rather unkindly kicked out, probably at the height of my need for support. But it had shown me there were others like me, same issue, maybe different struggles. I felt really strongly there was a need for somewhere for people to belong, feel understood and accepted, whatever the outcome, whatever the issue. Infertility, baby loss, pregnancy, or postnatal issues. Support when it was needed without expectation of the person in need. And so, Muma Nurture was born. We opened maybe 7 years ago now. But next month, or this month actually, we've been a registered charity for 5.5 years. And 5.5 is more significant than people realise. Because with 1 in 7 struggling with infertility, 1 in 5 experiencing baby loss, and another 1 in 5 struggling with perinatal mental health issues, out of every 10 people, 5.5 are struggling with the issues Muma Nurture supports. People are still so quiet about it. It's surrounded by secrecy and shame, and people all around you could be suffering without you ever knowing. When the reality is, these issues are just as prevalent as cancer, just as likely to affect you and the ones you love, just as random, and depending on your viewpoint, just as damaging. Maybe they also need the same recognition, research, fundraising, and support. Maybe. In these 7 years, while Muma Nurture has quietly continued doing what it's always done and supported hundreds of people through their personal journeys, I've also had my own. Clearly, this has developed into a job I love and a community I'm so appreciative to be a part of. I'm so proud of what we've achieved as an organisation and every part that I've played in that. I know now, without a shadow of a doubt, the world needs people like me. I had the vision and the capability to not just create this, but also adapt to every disaster placed in our way to ensure we're still here and still doing. And that takes a special kind of commitment that not everyone has. At some point, I became really okay with myself because I knew that even if I never had children, I had a legacy. And for some reason, the idea of not just never having children, but also never leaving my mark on the planet, had always plagued me. At some point, I had to accept that, children or not, I couldn't remain childless with a man who was already a father, had promised me children, and was not prepared to do everything, or even anything, in his power to make sure that happened for me. He'd promised to support me to build and run the charity, as he understood how important it was to me and how hurt I was by my own childlessness. When he also started to backtrack and undermine that, it was time to go. It was tough. I lost my home, my marriage, my stepkids, and a lot of my identity. But I held tight to the knowledge that it was the best choice for me, and all I could do was look after myself. I had no influence over anyone else's behaviour or reactions. I wrote a list of things I wanted to achieve before I was 40, both serious and frivolous, and got busy making those things happen and investing time and energy into my own happiness and well-being that had been severely lacking for the longest time. In the process of doing that, and without any real thought or planning, I met my husband. I wasn't looking for a new one. In actual fact, at that point in time, I couldn't think of anything worse. But I thought he was brilliant from the moment we met, and here we are. We've been married for 3 years, have a 1-year-old, and another one on the way. I essentially have the life I always wanted. And mostly that happened not by me fighting relentlessly for it, which I'd been doing all my life, but by me letting go of what I thought I should do and just doing what I could to ensure I was living a good life and being a good person. It didn't all come easily for us. We had a year of trying with no pregnancy, which was of no major surprise, because by then I was bloody old and most likely infertile. We quickly moved on to a year of IVF. It was draining, emotionally, physically, and financially. Disgusting, grueling, disastrous, and a complete and utter failure. People often ask me what the positives of IVF are, and I think the only one can be a positive result and a live baby at the end of it. Other than that, it's really not something you'd wish on your worst enemy. It's relentless injections, drugs, appointments, progesterone pessaries, waiting, and just more waiting. We'd had treatment abroad, there were still lockdowns happening, and we couldn't get back to our embryos. We were told it would cost £4,000 to get them here before we'd even paid for treatment, and it was just impossible. At a loss as to what else to do, we had another round here. It was just a disaster from start to finish, and a totally pointless waste of our money. I felt like I'd abandoned my children, or any chance of having any, abroad, and I should have never left. The doctor here said he'd be happy to continue to treat us, but now thought our odds were significantly lower than he originally had, and maybe we needed to consider it was the end of the road. I was too old, and it was never going to happen. I was just devastated. That last round was awful. Our treatment here was nothing like what we'd received abroad, and it really didn't feel like it was about us at all. Nobody seemed to know us or hear us, and from start to finish, it just didn't go very well. Nevertheless, I held tight to my hope. I was due to test just before Christmas and dreamed of this being the Christmas that I was finally pregnant. It would be the best present ever. But I didn't even get to test. The week before, on a super busy finishing up day at work, I started bleeding so heavily I had to go home and change. And then I had to smile and engage and pretend I was okay all through the rest of the day and the next, while my heart just shattered. Why couldn't it just have waited a few days so I could be by myself? Why did it always have to be so super shit? At least with the bleeding, it was obvious and it was done. I was told it was pointless testing. It was over. The round before, testing day, was one of my niece's birthdays. Again, potentially a lovely day to find out you're pregnant. It was negative, but there'd been no bleeding or sign thereof, so we were told to wait a couple of days and test again. We did, and the same happened. The next time, we did both blood and urine tests, and both were negative. The outcome was definite, but I still didn't bleed. In fact, I didn't bleed for weeks, and that whole time, I carried a secret hope that there'd been a mistake somewhere, and in fact, I was magically pregnant after all. I'm really not sure what was worse. It's always so odd when we look back at that Christmas and just how sad it was. Because by the very next one, our son was here, alive and kicking, having been born just a few days before. It was only a month or two after that doctor suggested we'd come to the end of the road that we found out I was pregnant. Naturally. What a turn up for the books. Despite my persistent pursuit of pregnancy that had been over a decade at that point, I found pregnancy really difficult. Not physically, I was fine, but emotionally, I was absolutely terrified. I just couldn't blindly assume everything was going to be okay, and I found other people doing so insanely stressful. I was semi-permanently on a miscarriage calculator, and at the beginning, my risk was more than half. 56.7%, if I remember correctly. It was more likely than not. So there was no counting chickens for me. I was going to be grateful for being pregnant and every day that I got, and just buckle in and try and survive it. An early scan that showed a heartbeat and correct placement dropped the risk significantly, but it was still high. 12 weeks dropped it further, 20 weeks further. I think around 22 to 24 weeks, it dropped below 5%. And at that point, I started to breathe again. I also knew at this stage the baby was potentially viable if they could get them out on time. But I had to be hyper alert to any issues, and so began another whole host of worries. And so it was that inch by inch and day by day, I got through that pregnancy. I really wanted home birth. I just wanted to feel as safe and comfortable as possible. But 4 days after my waters broke and labour started, there was still no baby. And I was just knackered, overwhelmed, and truly terrified that my baby wouldn't be okay. I ended up in an ambulance to hospital and having an emergency C-section. It wasn't at all what I wanted. But my baby was finally here. I literally couldn't believe it. We spent that first few days in hospital, just the two of us. And I hated it. It really wasn't the start that I'd imagined or hoped for. I felt trapped and alone, and like I just needed my space, people and things, probably more than I ever had before. I found that first few weeks of motherhood totally overwhelming. By the time we got out of hospital, there was just so much I knew and could do that my husband didn't, that it felt all my job. and a massive divide between us. I've never experienced tiredness like it, and trying to navigate that with a tiny being that is so totally dependent on you is a lot. And more than once, I found myself crying hysterically, wondering why I wanted this so much and if I was really up to it. They say everything's temporary, and I'm learning that's really true of baby stages. By the time you get comfortable and in your groove with one, they're on to the next. And eventually you get comfortable with the ever-changing and are very in tune with your baby, so you feel fairly confident with it and your abilities. About the time this happened to me, it was time to go back to work, and we found out I was pregnant again. We weren't expecting it at all, and I have to say, I thought all the lectures about contraception were pretty stupid, since I'd been told so many times I was old and fat and unlikely to ever get pregnant. I also exclusively breastfed, but it appears that none of those things are fail-safes. I'm truly grateful I have got to experience the other side of the coin. I love being a mum, and even the most excruciating moments are constantly teaching me something. All of the moments that have brought me here have given me greater insight into the experiences others endure, and just how necessary the support we provide at Muma Nurture truly is.